All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our second installment of Wellness Wednesday with our Workplace Wellness at Home series. My name is Grace Bennett, and I am a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and population health specialist with Apex Benefits. And I'm really excited about today's topic because it's one of my favorites to talk about. It's nutrition myths. As a dietitian, I hear all the time people coming to me with questions kind of, I saw this online, what do you think? Or my friend's doing this, what do you think about this? We have so much access to information now that sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to know kind of what's true and what's not. So that's kind of the topic for today. It'll be a jam-packed 30 minutes, so I hope that you're excited and ready to learn. So we'll go ahead and start with a little bit of trivia. So I ask that you kind of just follow along here at home and see kind of how you stack up against the answers here. So we'll go ahead and start. The U.S. weight loss and diet control market is worth how much? So make a mental note, an actual note, just a guess of how much you think is kind of poured into this industry every year. And it's a pretty staggering number. So about $73 billion is invested in this weight loss and diet control market every year. That's from the most recent data, came from about 2018. And what's alarming is that was about a 4% increase from 2017. So pretty sizable increase. And we're expecting to see about a 3% growth in that number every year. So, as much as we would like to think that this amount of money is put towards sustainable and healthy lifestyle improvements, unfortunately, we know that's not necessarily true, right? These are things like diet trends, fad diets, weight loss products, social media, etc. So that just kind of sets the scene of how much is kind of poured into giving us messaging regarding diet culture and nutrition. So along the same lines, food companies spend about how much each year on advertising? Take a second, take your best guess. Not quite as high, but it's still really, really high with $33 billion each year. And about $2 billion of that 33 is, specifically on marketing towards children. So unfortunately, this is kind of a systemic, issue that you could say we deal with from a very young age, kind of getting messaging on food advertising, on weight loss, on diet. And again, think about what kind of advertising it is, right? How often do you see a commercial for an apple or fresh vegetables, right? That's not really where the money is going. So along these same lines, how many Americans do you think go on a diet every year? So with this one, we're looking at about 45 million people. This is a self-reported study, so basically everyone, they self-identify as having gone on a diet, and about half of those that answered reported using a fad diet. So that's kind of things that pop up suddenly and become really popular, and it's kind of hard to sort through that. So of those people, how much or what percentage do you think actually regained weight that was lost? This is where I always get, someone always says 100%. It's not quite that high, but it's still really high. About 80 to 90% of people who go on diets tend to regain the weight that they lost. So this shows us that those fad diets, what's really popular in the media is more often than not, not sustainable in the long run. So what I'm getting at with this is that nutrition, unfortunately, has become kind of a money-making machine, and it's often based on deception, which is frustrating as a dietitian, but also as a consumer. So today's presentation, we're going to address 5 nutrition topics that I hear about a lot. We're going to kind of go through, decide what's true, what's not, and then really take a look at what the science is telling us, because that's often something that's forgotten. So we're going to go ahead and start with our first topic. This is a statement I hear a lot, both from clients and just in the media. A calorie is a calorie. So do we think this is true? Do we think this is not true? I would identify this as a myth. And so it's kind of important to understand what we're talking about here, right? Are all calories really equal? When you take a second to think about what a calorie actually is, it's a unit of energy. So in that sense, yes, a calorie is a calorie because a calorie is, equal to another in its units of energy. But that's not how we think about it in our everyday life. So practically speaking, we hear things like 100 calories is 100 calories. Doesn't really matter what food, where it comes from, right? And what this kind of statement forgets is that the same amount of calories from different food sources may be metabolized or broken down, processed by the body in a different way. So our metabolism, our hormones, our appetite, all respond to the type of food regardless of the amount of calories. So we're going to kind of dive into each one of these, and we're going to first look at metabolism, which again is kind of the breakdown process for foods in the body. So different foods undergo different metabolic pathways. In other words, the different processes that break down, and those different pathways require different amounts of energy. So we often forget, and sometimes it can be a little bit counterintuitive, but as we eat calories, to break those down, for the body to break those down and actually use the nutrition in them, we use calories throughout that process. So I love this picture because it gives it a really great example. So on the right here, you see these whole, unprocessed, more natural foods, fruits, veggies, proteins, whole grains, things like that. These are what we call really nutrient-dense or complex foods. And I mean complex in a good way. So there's a lot of good nutrition in there, a lot that the body is going to benefit from. And so to break these foods down, because they're more complex, takes more calories. On the left side there with the purple background, you'll see this kind of represents our more processed food items. So processed meaning they're just not as nutrient dense. They're what we call calorie dense. They give us calories, but they don't give us a whole lot of nutrition otherwise. And so these are actually more simple for the body to break down. And in doing so, we actually use fewer calories with those metabolic pathways. So what we are looking at here is a higher net calorie retention, meaning we take in all these calories, but we're not burning as much. So we hold on to more, and that's where you can see weight gain. So again, we're looking at the source of food as the most important factor here. So next, we're going to look at hormones, and I'm hopefully not standing in the way between anyone and their lunchtime. So hopefully not too many of you are out here looking like a little bit upset pup at the top there. But the main hormone we talk about with eating is ghrelin. It's what we call the hunger hormone. So this tells our brain that we're hungry, right? So if it goes up, if you haven't eaten in a while, you might be looking a little hangry. And then once we eat, it goes back down and we become our nice little angel selves, right? So what science is telling us is that some nutrients or certain diet elements have actually shown an increase in ghrelin levels. So the biggest factor that they've found is fructose, which is a simple sugar. It's found in more processed food items, things like bottled or canned sauces, sodas, packaged sweets, and that has shown some increase in baseline ghrelin levels. So again, remembering what ghrelin does, it tells us that we're hungry. You can imagine that the higher the ghrelin levels, we're probably going to feel more hungry, and we're probably going to take more food or increase our food intake. So there's a whole lot of factors to consider here. And again, it could be the same amount of calories, but the food source is what's going to affect our hormones. And then we look at appetite as well. So different foods have a different effect on fullness or satiety. And foods higher on the satiety index, basically a fullness scale, often lead to less consumption throughout the rest of the day, which, makes sense. If you're feeling fuller, you're not going to go back to the kitchen for more food, right? And I love this picture because it shows us exactly what, this kind of myth talks about. So here we have a 500 calorie portion of different foods, and it's representing how full we feel with 500 calories of that food. So you'll see here on the left, we have fats. Fats and processed carbs, it's surprisingly easy to get 500 calories of this type of food. We might feel full for a little bit, 20, 30, 40 minutes. But we've all experienced that where we just ate, and then we feel hungry again. So proteins are going to be a little bit higher on the fullness scale or the satiety index. And then obviously highest here is fruits and vegetables, and we'll go into why that's the case in a little bit. But it just shows us that, 500 calories is going to affect our appetite in different ways. So we can't make these blanket statements that 100 calories is 100 calories because we know now that the effects of those 100 calories are going to be very different based on the source of the food. So moving into our second topic, which is one of my favorites, a healthy diet includes plenty of carbs. Do we think this is a myth? Do we think this is a fact? Kind of take a second, take your guess. This, and I always surprise people, is actually a fact. So carbs get a really bad reputation, and I often hear, misconception. There's misconception that carbs make us fat. They make us gain weight, and alone, that's not true. As with anything in excess can lead to weight gain. So it's too broad of a statement that carbs in general lead to weight gain. So when I say carbs or carbohydrates, our minds have kind of been trained to think of things like pastas, breads, sweets, almost brown foods. It's kind of easy to categorize them that way. But it's important to understand all the sources of carbohydrates and everything that falls under that umbrella. So when you look at the picture here on your screen, you will see some, brown foods, but you'll also see a good amount of color variety. There's different types of foods that we might forget fall under this category of carbohydrates. So here on the left side, we have a list of kind of carb-rich foods. They kind of, there are typical culprits, if you will: sodas, white bread, desserts, ice cream. Refined carbs is what we call these. And basically what that means is that these types of foods provide us carbohydrates, they provide calories, but they're not that nutrient-dense, high-quality foods that we're looking for. So we do want to limit these in our diet because they really don't give us a whole lot of nutrition overall. But what we forget when we say, all carbs are bad, we forget about the other half of the group here, right? So vegetables, fruits, beans, nuts, whole grains, potatoes, all of these things fall under the category of carbohydrate as well. So these are the things we really want to focus on incorporating more of. And with these, not only are you getting carbohydrates and calories, but you're also getting other macro and micronutrients that really are essential for proper body function. And it's important to understand, okay, so you're telling me I need to incorporate carbs in my diet, but why, right? So carbohydrates are the body's main energy source. So when you're looking at the breakdown of your food intake throughout the day or at a meal, about half of that should come from carbohydrates. And so this is where it's important to focus on what we call complex carbohydrates, or those high quality carbs. The list on the right side from the last slide: fruits, vegetables, whole grains. And the reason we want to incorporate more of those is because they're rich in fiber, which helps with a whole host of things: digestion, cholesterol, fullness. But it also provides a lot of other nutrients like vitamins and minerals. So when it comes to carbohydrates, we absolutely need them in our diet. We just want to make sure we're emphasizing those high quality, more complex carbs, as we know they're going to give us a lot of nutrition benefits, and really limit kind of these low quality, refined carbohydrates over here. So looking at our third topic here, this is one I've heard a lot more in the past year. I've heard this a lot: limit fruit due to high sugar content. So myth, fact, do we think it's true or false? This one I would absolutely identify as a myth. And again, we have to look at the whole picture here, right? So we have kind of the incorrect assumption here is that fruit is just too high in sugar, it's too high in carbs, calories, and it's important to understand the distinction. So yes, fruit contains sugar, but it's a different type of sugar than something like added sugar. So I have two pictures here. One with the yellow background represents our more processed high sugar items, desserts, candy. And then on the right here, of course, we have our fruit sources, our natural sugar. And there's a big difference in these, the way they're broken down, the other nutrients we get. So when we think about added sugars, these are the sugars that we're concerned about. We kind of hear the term sugar in general and we're like, oh no, this is not good. But again, we have to understand the difference. So added sugars are just that. They're added by manufacturers to make products more sweet, sometimes to increase shelf life. And these are really processed, simple sugars. So what happens in the body with these types of added sugars is that we get a really quick increase in our blood sugar, and then we've all heard of the sugar crash, right? So we get a really sharp drop in our blood sugar. And over time, kind of those dramatic increases in blood sugar, those spikes, can actually be harmful and cause an increased risk of things like diabetes or heart disease. So the difference with fruit sugar is that, yes, fruit contains sugar, but it also contains another important factor, and that's fiber. And fiber is something that's not broken down, it's not digested by the body, and so it moves through us a little bit slower. It moves through our digestive system slower. And because of that, the fruit sugar, it doesn't cause a huge spike. It's more of an even increase and rise in blood sugar and an even decrease. So when you compare it to the way the body responds to those added sugars with those dramatic spikes, it's just simply not the same. And so we kind of avoid that harmful up and down with our blood sugar. And this is even more true when you consume something like fruit with another food group, like protein or fat, both of which are kind of slower to digest. And if you've ever worked with me on an individual basis, you'll know that that's one of my favorite things to say, is to always try to combine food groups when you eat. And, this is part of the reason why, because it kind of helps regulate our blood sugar and avoid those harmful up and downs. And then you also have to think about what else is there in fruit that's going to be beneficial. It's kind of a similar idea to the carbohydrate discussion we just had. So we're going to get a whole lot of other good things like fiber, vitamins, minerals, each of which have a different color represented in nature. So I think that's really, really cool, really interesting. We always hear, make your plate as colorful as possible. And the reason being is that the more color is on your plate, the more vitamins and minerals are represented. So you're getting a really well-balanced meal. So the next question I always get kind of with fruit especially is, well, what about people with type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes? And yes, people with diabetes do need to watch their sugar and their carb intake maybe a little bit more closely than a person without diabetes. But again, it's important to look at the big picture here, knowing that fruit sugar and these kinds of items are not going to cause the same spike and up and down in blood sugar as something as a more refined added sugar might. So we have to think, remember the fiber, remember the other benefits that come with sugar. And so absolutely the pros outweigh the cons here. And there's definitely a place for fruit in the diet of a person with diabetes. And the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics kind of had similar questions, right? They wanted to see, how does this relate to the development of maybe chronic diseases over time? So what they did was they followed a group, it was a cohort study. They followed a group of individuals for about 12 years, and they didn't do any intervention. They didn't change anything about these individuals' diets. They just tracked what they ate. And they wanted to see, well, how is this going to relate to the development of different conditions later on? And so what they found was that actually a moderate amount of fruit intake, so about 2 cups a day or more, led to a lower risk of diseases like type 2 diabetes, heart attack, stroke, heart disease, several types of cancer. So does fruit have carbohydrates and sugar? Yes, it does, but there's a whole lot of added benefits to including fruit in your daily diet, and so we shouldn't really be afraid to do so. This brings us to our next, speaking of sugar, right? So to lose weight, avoid your favorites. And this kind of represents an all or nothing mentality that I hear about a lot in working with individuals. I would say this is absolutely a myth. So when we say things like that, we're getting into a restrictive space. So what we tend to do is go all or nothing. Here are my list of foods I can eat. Here's my list of foods that are bad that I can't eat. And the more you restrict or eliminate certain foods, your psyche actually changes. And so what happens is we have this kind of restriction here. And then eventually you become just really, really hyper aware of what you're not eating. And we may have experienced this on a personal level. You become preoccupied with those things that you're not, quote unquote, not supposed to be eating. And that leads to, the more we think about it, the more we crave it. And willpower is a great thing, but it only lasts so long, right? And so there's an increased likelihood that eventually, basically, you're going to cave, if you will. And you're going to go on what we call, it's a binge. So that just means that you kind of overdo it and you go overboard than you would otherwise, because you've been kind of thinking about it for so long and trying not to eat XYZ food for so long. And then we kind of overdo it. And this leads to guilt, right? Because I broke my diet, I ate a food I'm not supposed to eat. And so this preoccupation and kind of becomes this unhealthy cycle. And the more guilty we feel, then we, think to ourselves, oh, well, now I got to restrict even more. So over time, this is just not realistic. And frankly, it's not enjoyable, right? So we need to kind of figure out ways to break that cycle. And the best way I can suggest to do this is to just kind of remember, give yourself some leeway, right? So you may have heard of the 80-20 or 90-10 rule. And basically what this says is that, it's a much more relaxed approach. So 80 to 90% of the time, do your best to incorporate those really high quality, or what we've referred to today as nutrient dense foods. So fruits, vegetables, those complex carbohydrates, those lean protein sources. Do your best most of the time, to try to incorporate those. But the important part here is building in some leeway. So understanding that we're all human. Food is an enjoyable part of life. We don't want to be feeling like we can't enjoy food. So giving yourself, 10 to 20% of the time, knowing that you're going to enjoy some treats or some comfort foods, and building in that flexibility eliminates that kind of restrictive mindset and makes it more enjoyable and more sustainable over time. So instead of these harsh black and white rules, understand that we're all human and give yourself a little bit of grace there. And so another thing to do is try to get in touch with your hunger cues. And it sounds a little bit silly because it's, I should know when I'm hungry, right? But as we grow older, we tend to kind of lose track of that. If you think about an infant will eat when it's hungry, and it's not going to eat when they're not hungry, right? As we get older, we kind of lose that. And it's hard to tell when our bodies are truly, truly hungry. So how, one way to do this is to use a hunger scale. And here's one that I like on the screen here. So 1 being, oh my gosh, I'm starving, I'm feeling weak, dizzy, I haven't eaten in a really long time. 10 is, so full you feel sick. This is like post-Thanksgiving, can't move from the couch kind of full. Our goal is to stay in this range of kind of this green range, this 3 to 6 range. And what you do is before you, a meal or a snack, you kind of take your own temperature, I guess, and figure out what hunger are you really feeling, and then honoring that hunger and not feeling guilty about honoring that hunger. And so as with anything, we kind of have to get in the habit of doing this. We have to practice and kind of train ourselves to do this. And that brings us to our last topic. Food packaging may be misleading. This one, hopefully is pretty clear, but it's unfortunately a fact, and it's a very frustrating fact as a dietitian and really just as a consumer to not know, kind of what our food packaging is telling us. So there's a lot of research on consumer behavior and how packaging affects our choices. And basically, these are some examples that I pulled from another dietitian, Lauren Link, who I follow. And she just provided some really great examples of how packaging, or how marketers are really invested in promoting these different ideas of health, right? So what research tells us is that packaging with green and light colored, labels, kind of like this Pop-Tarts package over here, are perceived to be healthier than the same exact product, just in a different package. So this kind of Pop-Tart simply is a good example. There might be, some slight differences between the typical Pop-Tarts, but I can guarantee you it's still not a hugely nutritious option. But we as consumers will perceive it as such because we have this nice kind of natural colors. We have the word simple, must be true, right? So another example is the sweet potato fettuccine, which again just kind of shows us that we shouldn't be eating pasta, right? Carbs are enemy number one. This isn't fettuccine, right? This is sweet potatoes cut in rectangles. We can call it what it is. And it's, I'm not saying this is a bad product, but it's just showing us that, we're constantly bombarded with the message of we shouldn't be having pasta, let me have sweet potatoes instead. There's absolutely room for both sweet potatoes and fettuccine in the diet, but unfortunately, this isn't the message that we're getting here. Another good example is a plant-based avocado dip. Again, I don't really know anything about this. I haven't looked at the labels or the ingredients, but we have the word plant-based here. I'd be a little bit concerned if we had an avocado pesto dip that wasn't plant-based. So this is just an example of kind of the marketing, people behind this product throwing on a word that they know is going to be perceived as healthy, and that's plant-based. It's just kind of another effort to sell a product as a healthy option. Another example here we have is keto mayo. This is an interesting example if you're not familiar. Keto is a popular diet that emphasizes fat as the main source of energy and a really, really low intake of carbohydrate. Not going to get too far into that. That could be a whole other session. But what you need to know is that it kind of promotes fat as fuel. But mayonnaise as is, without this kind of keto label, is 100% fat already. So the only difference with this product is the word keto on it. And this is, a kind of a buzzword. It's a hot topic. It's a fad diet. And it probably, the goal is here to say, oh, I'm making a good choice. But again, just one of those examples of those $73 billion kind of put into this diet and weight loss culture. And there is some regulation when it comes to food packaging, but unfortunately, there's a lot of loopholes for what we call structure function claims, basically relating a nutrient to a disease state. And there is regulation by the Food and Drug Administration, but it's really easy to get around it, unfortunately. So, for example, the FDA would need to approve a statement such as this product may reduce the risk of heart disease. But there's absolutely no regulation on the statement, this product helps maintain a healthy heart. So you can see that these essentially imply the same thing, right? It's good for my heart. As a consumer, I'm not looking at the details. I'm not looking at the difference. So this Rice Krispies box here is a good example of this. It says now helps support your child's immunity. There's no regulation that could be on any packaging anywhere. So unfortunately, it's kind of up to us to understand that this is a problem that exists. Here we have a few more kind of buzzwords that these studies have found to cause consumers to identify products as healthier. So we have gluten-free, natural, simple, antioxidants, and a lot of these have absolutely no regulation, meaning they can be put on anything. One thing I thought was interesting was fair trade. In this study, consumers perceived items with the word fair trade as healthier. And, though it's great to have an ethically sourced product, fair trade has absolutely nothing to do with the nutritional properties of food. So again, just shows us the power of marketing, and really that we have to be kind of our own detectives here. So I know we're coming up on our 30 minutes, so I'll kind of just put all this information up here. But this is where the nutrition facts label becomes really important. And so this is kind of the breakdown on the slide is the different sections. So I would recommend that, rather than trust the front of the package, you kind of have to make sure you flip your product over and look at what the nutrition is really, really telling you, knowing that the regulation for what goes on the front is not as robust as we would like it to be. So we kind of have to be our own label detectives here. So I know that was a whole lot of information in just a short amount of time. I really appreciate you spending your lunch hour with me. Again, my name is Grace, and here's my email. If there's any questions that you have about today's topics or something, that was a little bit confusing, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be happy to touch base with you. We hope that you've enjoyed this kind of workplace wellness at home series, and coming up on Friday at 9 a.m., we have a group fitness with Liz Greer, who's a wonderful instructor, really great energy. So I encourage you all to register for that. I know it's going to be a lot of fun. It'll get your Friday started off well. So I thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you on Friday. Have a great afternoon.